When Eilat Mazar realized she discovered an ancient structure near Jerusalem, she turned to the Bible to help explain what she found.
And she learned that this new discovery supports the biblical accounts of King David and his son Solomon.
There's a story in the Bible where Solomon goes into dream state and God comes to him in dream state and he says, anything that you want, I will give you. If you want wealth, I'll give you wealth. I'll make you the richest man. If you want kingdoms, I'll give you the kingdoms. Tell me whatever it is that you want and I'll give it to you. And Solomon didn't ask for riches, didn't ask for kingdoms. He asked for one thing. He said, give me wisdom.
For nearly 5,000 years, ancient texts warned that this place should never be disturbed. Not because it was empty, not because it was forgotten, but because what lay inside was never meant to be seen again. Now, beneath the crumbling hills of Jerusalem, layered with centuries of buried secrets, an ancient presence has finally stirred. The discovery didn't just surprise archaeologists. It awakened a question humanity may not have been ready to ask. Is it really his grave, or a trick of time and stone? Let's unravel what was found, and why the world may not have been ready for it. Before we go any further, take a moment to like and subscribe. We appreciate your support. The mystery might have remained buried indefinitely, if not for a detail so small it barely registered at first glance.
So gatehouses were actually these really complex chambered structures.
For generations, it was dismissed as folklore until a forgotten passage beneath Jerusalem forced the conversation open again. Centuries of searching had carved tunnels through the hills, driven by whispers of a king buried with wealth beyond imagination, a ruler whose name refused to fade with time, Solomon, remembered not only for wisdom, but for presiding over a kingdom whose scale stunned the ancient world. Solomon did not ascend the throne as a fully formed monarch. He became king while still young, inheriting a kingdom shaped by his father, David, a realm forged through conflict, consolidation, and fragile unity. What Solomon inherited was not peace, but pressure. And what he created was not merely stability, but scale. Under his reign, the kingdom did not simply survive. It expanded economically, politically, and logistically. Trade routes flourished beyond Israel's borders. Wealth did not trickle in, it surged. Gold became common. Silver lost its value. This was not the profile of a symbolic ruler. It was the signature of a centralized authority capable of organizing resources across regions. At the heart of Solomon's power stood his most enduring achievement, the First Temple. Built over 7 years, it was not a modest sanctuary. It was a massive construction project requiring imported cedar from Lebanon, precision-cut stone, and enormous quantities of metal. Solomon's famous judgments reinforce this picture. Like the one where 2 women claimed the same child, Solomon offered to split the child in half, not out of cruelty, but to see who would give him up. And one did. That's how he found the real mother. That single moment turned him into a symbol of justice and intelligence across the ancient world. His reputation traveled far beyond Jerusalem. The Queen of Sheba did not arrive as a pilgrim. She came as an equal, bringing riddles, wealth, and diplomatic intent. Caravans heavy with spices and gold crossed deserts to reach him. She left not simply impressed, but unsettled. This is where the image of Solomon begins to shift, because wisdom, when paired with absolute authority, leaves footprints. It reshapes economies. It reorganizes trade. It alters landscapes. Ships sailed to distant ports named Ophir and Tarshish, places many believe lay in Africa or even as far as India, returning with ivory, exotic animals, and rare goods. And beneath this wealth was something far less poetic, but far more revealing: metal. In regions to the south, including areas near the Timna Valley and across Edom, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of large-scale copper production active in the very century. Solomon is said to have ruled industrial operations capable of supplying the kind of material his projects required. These were not symbolic resources. They were the backbone of an empire. And yet, one question has never been answered. Where is Solomon's tomb? There is no confirmed burial chamber, no marker, no inscription, nothing to indicate where a ruler of such scale was laid to rest. Some believed it must lie beneath the Temple Mount itself. Others pointed to hidden caves, sealed chambers, places deliberately erased from memory. Over time, the search stalled. Too many dead ends, too many legends layered over fact. Most scholars eventually walked away. But the silence never fully settled, because when a king leaves behind infrastructure, trade systems, and industrial footprints, his absence is not easily explained. And that is where this story begins to change. What followed was described by some as chance, by others as inevitability, but either way, it shattered a mystery that had resisted centuries of pursuit. What emerged was not simply a burial site, it was a signal, a deliberately concealed system, sealed in silence for nearly 3,000 years, now forcing itself back into view. And what lay within was only the beginning. The search for Solomon's tomb had always felt futile. Medieval knights, once carved into the earth beneath the Temple Mount, convinced the answer lay directly below their feet. Centuries later, 19th-century explorers tore through the hills of Judea, guided by maps that promised everything and delivered nothing. Each attempt ended the same way: empty tunnels, collapsed theories, and quiet resignation. By the time the modern era arrived, most scholars had stopped looking altogether. Then the evidence shifted. Dr. Emily Carter, an archaeologist more comfortable among fragile manuscripts than excavation sites, was deep inside Jerusalem's archival records when something refused to be ignored. Ancient tax documents from the era traditionally attributed to Solomon contained a subtle irregularity. Payments recorded without a destination, resources accounted for, but deliberately detached from place. In a kingdom where metal, labor, and tribute were tightly managed, as proven by contemporaneous copper production operating at industrial scale, in the South, such omissions were not clerical errors. They were intentional. The trail pointed toward a location near the city of David, a site referenced only indirectly, positioned just far enough outside official records to vanish from memory. As one historian put it, "If you dig beneath that ground, what rises from the soil has a habit of matching ancient text." Using ground-penetrating radar capable of reading through solid limestone, Carter's team turned their focus to a steep, unforgiving slope in Silwan. The terrain resisted every step. Jagged rock tore at equipment. Unstable soil slowed progress. Political tensions halted work repeatedly, yet they returned, day after day, because whatever was hidden there had not survived by accident. Then nature intervened. A sudden rainstorm weakened the hillside, exposing a shallow depression in the earth. At first glance it looked unremarkable, but something about it felt wrong, out of place. Beneath that exact point, radar readings surged, pulsing with unnatural regularity. The scans revealed tunnels, deep, purpose-cut, man-made, carved nearly 13 meters below the surface. Excitement rippled through the team. The site was secured immediately. Every movement became calculated, because this was not a simple passageway. The tunnel system was engineered with false entrances and dead ends, a defensive layout consistent with other high-value sites tied to royal infrastructure, where missteps were designed to trigger collapse and erase intrusion. Night after night, Dr. Carter studied fragments of ancient inscriptions recovered nearby. The markings were not ornamental. They were directional, subtle cues, meant to mislead the careless and guide only those patient enough to read them correctly. The intelligence behind the design echoed the same logistical thinking required to manage large-scale mining and resource transport centuries earlier. Yet even that was not the true turning point. The moment came from an old story, a fragment of oral tradition passed down by shepherds who spoke of a hillside that glowed beneath moonlight, of a wall that shimmered like scattered stars. Standing on that very slope, Carter felt it immediately. The ground was saturated. Boots sank with every step. The air felt heavy, intentional, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. They knew they were close. Beyond the sealed passage, behind a doorway untouched since antiquity, something waited, and when the ancient seal was finally broken, the impact was immediate. This was not a quiet discovery. It was a release. A stone slab, never meant to be disturbed, shifted with a sound that echoed like something long restrained, finally exhaling. What if the only thing separating the modern world from a 3,000-year-old secret? That was the moment history stopped feeling distant. The seal did not give way gently. When it finally moved, it did so with force, a deep, resonant roar. Like something ancient releasing a breath it had been holding for thousands of years. After weeks of cutting through jagged limestone, choking dust, and lingering uncertainty, Emily Carter and her team stood at the end of a trail that began not in myth, but in paperwork, faded tax records that led them to a forgotten hillside in Silwan. Now, they faced a stone slab buried so deeply that it felt as though the earth itself had worked to conceal it. This was no ordinary obstruction. The slab functioned as more than a door. It was a boundary, a warning, a piece of engineering meant to be understood, not forced. Pushing or pulling would accomplish nothing. The stone was integrated into a larger system, one designed to protect whatever lay beyond it. Within the tunnel walls, false corridors branched away from the true path. Dead ends lurked, where a wrong step could trigger collapse, sealing the passage forever. This was ancient stonework, but the logic behind it was anything but primitive. It reflected the same level of planning seen in large-scale industrial sites, from Solomon's-era systems built to manage risk, control access, and outlast human interference. Whoever designed this expected intruders, and they made sure those intruders would fail. As the ground shifted beneath their boots, Dr. Carter focused on a series of weathered Hebrew markings carved near the entrance. They were not decorative. 7 lines, 7 symbols, a repeating pattern tied unmistakably to the 7-year construction of the first temple. This was not ornamentation, it was instruction. The team moved with extreme precision. Laser scanners traced every surface. 3D mapping equipment logged each groove and angle. Every action felt less like excavation and more like defusing an explosive. The air was thick with tension. One miscalculation could bury the entire crew under centuries of carefully balanced stone. For 3 straight days, they adjusted hidden mechanisms, aligned ancient components, and froze each time stone scraped against stone. The deeper they advanced, the quieter the tunnel became, as if the mountain itself were aware of what was unfolding. Then, it happened. A sharp crack cut through the silence. A low rumble followed. Dust poured from the ceiling as the slab began to shift, not smoothly, not quickly, but just enough. A narrow slit opened into darkness. They stepped back. No sound emerged. No rush of air. Only cold, waiting blackness. Dr. Carter raised her hand. The signal was immediate. Everyone stopped. No one spoke. No one moved. This was more than a breakthrough. It was the first breath of a story that had not been told in 3,000 years. And whatever lay beyond that opening was not finished revealing itself. The tomb, if that is what it truly was, had not surrendered its final secret yet. What came next would test even the most hardened skeptics. And from here on, there was no turning back. A glimpse into Solomon's wealth came without warning. The instant a flashlight beam caught the edge of gold, time seemed to lock in place. No one spoke, no one breathed. There was only the shared realization that they were no longer chasing legend. They were standing inside it, deep beneath the city of David, inside a sealed chamber untouched for millennia. Dr. Carter's team stood shoulder to shoulder, their lights trembling slightly as they swept the room. What lay before them was not rumor or folklore. It was material reality. Treasure arranged with intention, stacked, grouped, and stored as if preserved for a future that never arrived. Along the stone walls rested golden vessels, their surfaces etched with ancient Hebrew, catching the light as though they had been polished only yesterday. The air carried a scent that did not belong to dust alone. Thyme, resins, spices earthy and sweet, still clinging to the chamber. At the far end rose a 7-branched menorah, solid and imposing. Its proportions, curves, and base aligned precisely with descriptions of the first temple. This was not a ceremonial copy. It bore the weight and craftsmanship of an object meant for use, and this was only the beginning. Every corner of the chamber spoke of reach and exchange. Faded fragments of silk, unmistakable in texture, pointed to trade routes stretching toward the Indian subcontinent. Delicately carved ivory hinted at negotiations with African kingdoms long erased from memory. Small jewelry boxes, some still sealed, held earrings and chains set with emeralds, rubies, and deep blue lapis lazuli. One archaeologist, visibly shaken, leaned in and whispered, "This makes the British Museum look like a thrift shop." Then came another shock. A sealed clay jar was carefully opened, releasing a soft bloom of scent saffron, frankincense, and a faint citrus note. The aroma was impossibly fresh, as if time itself had paused the moment the lid was closed. It felt staged, preserved, planned, yet not everything fit neatly. Some artifacts carried markings no one could immediately identify. A few styles felt inconsistent, newer, or at least different. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. Could parts of this collection belong to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, or another ruler who chose to shelter his wealth beside a growing legend? The excitement in the room was undeniable, but so was the uncertainty. And in a chamber like this, doubt does not stay quiet. It echoes. Still, taken together, the objects formed a coherent picture. Not excess for excess's sake, but the stored output of a system, a kingdom capable of sourcing, refining, and distributing enormous quantities of material. The same logistical mindset that once coordinated industrial copper production in the South is visible here, translated into ritual, wealth, and preservation. As dazzling as the chamber was, it did not feel like a conclusion. The team moved carefully. Laser scanners traced every surface. Nothing was touched without documentation. One careless movement could erase what the desert had protected for centuries. The menorah alone had the potential to rewrite what we understand about the First Temple, but no one celebrated, because they had come searching for a tomb. And this did not feel like one. Everyone sensed it. This chamber was not the end of the story. It was a threshold, the first layer of something deeper, something deliberately buried, not forgotten. The gold was breathtaking. The artifacts were staggering, but it was the writing on the walls, the symbols, the patterns, the unresolved instructions that finally stopped them cold. Whatever lay deeper had been hidden for a reason. It did not appear in a prophecy. It did not surface in legend. It was not uncovered by someone searching for a tomb. It appeared in paperwork. While examining administrative records from Solomon's reign, Scholars noticed something unusual, not what was written, but what was missing. Among tax documents and logistical accounts, there were references to payments dispatched regularly to a location that was never named. No city, no landmark, no geographic identifier of any kind. In a system otherwise obsessed with precision, the omission stood out. These were not ceremonial offerings. They were routine allocations, labor, materials, resources, redirected quietly, consistently, and without explanation. The destination was always the same, yet never identified. The records simply moved on, as if the location required no clarification for those who originally read them. The site, based on contextual clues, pointed toward an area near the city of David, a region layered with history, excavation scars, and unresolved questions. A place where ancient construction often lies beneath later rebuilding, hidden not by distance, but by density. This was not the kind of clue treasure hunters dream about. There were no coordinates, no dramatic references, just an administrative silence repeated often enough to become suspicious. What made it unsettling was intention. Someone had gone out of their way not to record this place, not once, but repeatedly, as if naming it would have been enough to compromise what it concealed, as if discretion itself was part of the design. When modern researchers followed the pattern, the trail led toward a steep, unstable slope in Silwan, a terrain long dismissed as unsuitable for major construction, too uneven, too fragile, too exposed. Exactly the kind of place no one would expect to hide something monumental. And that was the moment the nature of the mystery shifted, because this was no longer about lost legends or forgotten stories. It was about logistics, about planning, about decisions made deliberately, quietly, and recorded only enough to ensure the system functioned, but never enough to reveal its purpose. The most dangerous secrets are rarely announced. They are embedded in routines. And whatever Solomon's administration was funding in silence, it was not meant to be remembered by name. It was meant to operate, to be built, and then to disappear from the record entirely. That realization changed everything. Because if this unnamed place truly existed, and if it required sustained resources during Solomon's reign, then it was not an accident of history. It was a project, and projects like that are never created without a reason. Following the paper trail did not lead to a monument. It led downward. The slope in Silwan was hostile to excavation in every way that mattered. The limestone was sharp enough to tear through gloves and equipment. The soil shifted unpredictably, refusing to hold a clean edge. Even standing still felt unsafe, as if the ground itself resented being disturbed. This was not a place builders would normally choose, unless they wanted to be left alone. As instruments were set and scans began, the hillside revealed nothing at first. No walls, no chambers, no signs of collapse that would suggest a buried structure, just uneven ground and stubborn stone. The kind of terrain that convinces teams to move on. Then, the readings changed. Beneath the surface, the data tightened into lines that did not belong to geology. Long, deliberate voids appeared too straight, too evenly spaced to be natural. Not a cave system, not erosion, something planned. The realization was immediate and unsettling. These were tunnels. They did not run randomly. They descended at calculated angles, branching and narrowing with intent. Their layout suggested not access, but resistance, a design meant to confuse, delay, and deter anyone who tried to follow them. False paths split off suddenly. Dead ends appeared where logic expected continuity. This was architecture built for exclusion. As excavation progressed, the atmosphere changed. Sound behaved differently underground, swallowed quickly by stone. Light felt inadequate, even when nothing visibly blocked it. The deeper the team moved, the more the space seemed to press inward, not collapsing, but asserting itself. It became clear that this descent was not merely physical. Every step carried the sense of crossing a threshold from open history into something private, controlled, and intentionally obscured. Whatever lay ahead was not meant to be stumbled upon. It required effort, commitment, risk, and that, too, felt deliberate, because the tunnels were not designed to honor the dead. They were designed to test the living. To proceed meant choosing to ignore centuries of warning. To continue meant accepting that retreat would not always be possible. The deeper they went, the fewer easy exits remained, replaced by narrow passages that demanded focus and precision. This was no longer an excavation site. It was a system, and systems like this are built with an understanding of human behavior, curiosity, greed, impatience. Every trap, every misleading turn, every narrowing corridor suggested that those who designed it knew exactly what kind of people might one day try to enter. They anticipated intruders, and they planned for them. By the time the team realized how carefully the descent had been engineered, they were already inside it. The surface felt distant. The modern world felt far away. What remained was stone, silence, and the growing certainty that this place had been designed to make one thing clear. Turning back was always an option, but continuing forward was a choice, and once that choice was made, the descent would not forgive hesitation. The tunnels did not end abruptly. They narrowed. Stone pressed closer on both sides, forcing movement to slow, tools to be lowered, voices to drop. The air felt heavier here, not stale, but contained, as if it had been waiting. Every surface bore the marks of intention. Edges too clean, angles too precise to be the work of collapse or chance. Then they saw it. A single stone slab sealed the passage ahead. It did not resemble a door. There were no hinges, no handles, no obvious seams. It sat flush against the surrounding rock, embedded so perfectly that, at first glance, it looked like part of the mountain itself. Only the faint outline, a line just slightly too straight, gave it away. This was not a barrier meant to be opened repeatedly. It was a boundary. Closer inspection revealed shallow carvings along the stone's edge. Not decoration, not prayer. Patterns measured and restrained, arranged in sequences that suggested instruction rather than warning. Whoever placed this slab did not rely on force alone. They relied on understanding. For a long moment, no one moved. Breaking a seal like this is never a neutral act. It is not discovery. It is intrusion. Once disturbed, it cannot be restored. Whatever lay beyond would no longer belong solely to the past. The decision to proceed was quiet. Tools were adjusted, measurements taken. The team worked slowly, as if the stone itself might respond to haste. As pressure was applied, the slab resisted not dramatically, but stubbornly. Then the mountain answered. The sound came first. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the passage, followed by a vibration that traveled through boots, through bone, through breath. Dust sifted down from above, suspended in the light like ash. The slab did not slide open. It shifted reluctantly, unevenly, as if something ancient were being forced awake. It did not feel like a door opening. It felt like permission being revoked. When the stone finally moved enough to expose a narrow gap, there was no rush of air, no smell, no sound from the other side. Only darkness, dense and absolute, pressing back against the light. The team stepped away instinctively. No one spoke. No one crossed the threshold. This was the line Solomon had drawn. Not with words, not with guards, but with silence and stone. For centuries, the seal had done its job. It had held, it had waited, and now, broken at last, it forced a realization that none of the planning, none of the technology, none of the preparation could soften. This was no longer about uncovering history. It was about confronting intention, because seals like this are not placed to protect treasure. They are placed to contain consequences. And whatever had been held back for so long was no longer confined to the past. It was now present. At first, everything looked familiar. Beyond the broken seal, the chamber opened into a space that felt deliberately composed, not chaotic. Stone walls stood firm, uncollapsed. The floor was clean, undisturbed by time or intrusion. This was not the aftermath of abandonment. It was preservation. And there it was, what everyone had expected to find: gold. Not scattered, not piled carelessly, but placed with intention. Vessels rested against the walls, their surfaces catching the light in dull flashes. Their forms were unmistakable, etched with ancient Hebrew markings, proportions consistent with royal workmanship. This was wealth meant to endure, not to be displayed. For a brief moment, the discovery felt almost reassuring. Solomon was remembered as unimaginably rich. Trade had brought gold from distant lands, silver had lost its value under his reign, and treasures had flowed into Jerusalem from across the known world. Finding wealth here made sense. It aligned with history. It fit the story everyone already knew. But that sense of order did not last. As the chamber was surveyed more carefully, other details began to surface, details that did not belong to a treasury. Carvings traced along the stone walls, not ornate, not symbolic in any obvious religious sense. Their lines were precise, repetitive, mathematical. These were not prayers. The patterns followed ratios. Angles repeated with unsettling accuracy, shapes unfolded into spirals, and intersecting planes that resembled schematics more than decoration. They were too exact to be artistic expression, yet too complex to be incidental. This was design. And then there was the menorah. It stood apart from the rest of the objects, rising from the floor as if anchored there. 7 branches, perfectly balanced. Its dimensions matched ancient descriptions of what once stood within the first temple, not a symbolic replica, but something that felt foundational. The craftsmanship was flawless. The surface bore no signs of corrosion or neglect. It should have been the centerpiece. Instead, it felt like a marker. The air itself seemed different here, not stagnant, but heavy with scent, earthy, resinous, faintly sweet. Traces of spices lingered, thyme and oils that had no reason to remain after centuries sealed underground. It was as if the chamber had been prepared to remain intact, not simply sealed and forgotten. Then came the realization that shifted everything. The wealth explained Solomon's power, but it did not explain the warnings. Treasures do not require systems of deception, collapsing passages, and seals carved with instruction. Gold does not justify silence lasting millennia. These defenses were not built to protect valuables. They were built to guard something else, something that did not want attention. And the deeper the team studied the carvings and arrangements, the clearer it became that the chamber was not a destination. It was a threshold. A carefully arranged introduction meant to satisfy expectation, and then redirect it. Because what Solomon had sealed away was not merely something to be admired, it was something to be understood. And whatever that understanding demanded, it was waiting beyond gold, beyond wealth, beyond everything history had prepared the world to expect. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. As attention moved away from the gold and toward the stone itself, the chamber began to read differently. The walls were not merely supporting the space. They were speaking not loudly, not plainly, but with structure, with sequence. Set into a recessed section of the chamber, a series of inscriptions emerged. Not ceremonial dedications, not funerary prayers. Their placement was deliberate, positioned at eye level, aligned with the geometry etched across the walls. These markings were meant to be read after the initial awe had passed. What they formed was not a record of death. It was instruction, lines repeated in groups. Patterns echoed earlier carvings found near the seal, ratios aligned with known measurements from the first temple, but then diverged, bending into forms that no surviving tradition fully accounts for. This was not theology as worship. It was theology as architecture, as system. The language itself resisted easy translation. Familiar Hebrew roots appeared, but their structure was altered, compressed, arranged as if meaning mattered less than precision. Some phrases read like guidance, others like caution. None resembled the tone of a ruler seeking remembrance. This was not written for Solomon's contemporaries. It was written for whoever stood here next. The realization settled slowly, heavily. The chamber was not meant to preserve memory. It was meant to transmit understanding selectively, conditionally, and only after effort had been expended to reach it. Every obstacle before this point now made sense. The tunnels, the traps, the seal, they were filters. Only those willing to descend, to endure confusion, to resist distraction by wealth, would ever arrive at the message intact. And even then, the message did not offer answers outright. It demanded interpretation. One passage stood apart from the rest. Its phrasing was personal, singular. It did not speak about wisdom. It spoke from it. The cadence carried authority without proclamation, as if the writer assumed the reader would recognize the voice without needing it named. This was not a warning carved to frighten intruders. It was a boundary drawn to slow them down. Because once read, the message could not be unread. It suggested that knowledge itself had weight, that certain understandings, once grasped, alter responsibility, that the act of knowing changes the knower. The chamber fell quiet again as the implications settled. If this was truly Solomon's hand at work, then he had not sealed away treasure to protect it from the world. He had sealed away insight to protect the world from itself. And he had done so with the assumption that one day someone would arrive here prepared, or at least curious enough to try. This was not a tomb speaking from the past. It was a voice waiting for the future. And now that the message had been uncovered, the question was no longer what Solomon had left behind. It was whether the modern world was capable of carrying what he had chosen to pass forward. News does not travel quietly anymore. Within hours of the first images leaving the site, the chamber ceased to be an archaeological discovery and became a global event. Files moved faster than any artifact ever could. Photographs, scans, translated fragments, measurements stripped of context, and reposted without restraint. What had been sealed in stone for millennia was suddenly subject to headlines, commentary, and speculation. The reaction fractured immediately. Some scholars called it a turning point. The convergence of text, architecture, and material culture too precise to dismiss. They pointed to the measurements aligned with known temple records, the administrative clues buried in tax documents, the defensive engineering far beyond what was typical of burial sites. To them, this was not mythology resurrected, but history finally catching up with intention. Others were unconvinced. They scrutinized every line of inscription, every angle carved into stone. They questioned the language too refined, some said, too aware of later literary structures. They noted symbols that felt anachronistic, patterns that hinted at influence beyond Solomon's era. Was this truly a voice from the 10th century BCE, or a masterful echo left by later hands? The debate spilled beyond academia. Theologians weighed implications that went far beyond authenticity. If the message was real, what did it suggest about wisdom, authority, and restraint? If Solomon had deliberately withheld knowledge, what did that say about humanity's readiness to receive it now? Media outlets rushed to simplify what could not be simplified. Some declared the discovery definitive. Others labeled it a hoax before the dust had settled. Online forums ignited. Experts argued live on streams. Institutions delayed statements, then issued careful non-answers. Yet beneath the noise, a quieter unease took hold. The arguments were no longer centered on gold or relics. They were about permission, about whether some discoveries, even if real, should ever be brought fully into the open, about whether progress is always synonymous with exposure. Because this find did not behave like other breakthroughs. It resisted closure. Every attempt to frame it as triumph, as fraud, as spectacle, left something unresolved. The chamber refused to be reduced to a single narrative. The message resisted consensus, and the deeper analysts went, the more they realized that certainty itself might have been the one thing Solomon never intended to leave behind. In the end, the world did what it always does when faced with discomfort. It argued. It categorized. It rushed to decide, but the chamber did not respond. It remained silent, holding back whatever lay beyond its first revealed layer. And in that silence, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The most unsettling part of the discovery was not what had been found. It was how quickly humanity tried to claim it, as if understanding could be owned, as if wisdom could be extracted without consequence. And somewhere beyond the chamber already opened, another boundary still waited untouched, untested, indifferent to debate, and unimpressed by noise. The world had reacted. But the story was not finished. When the arguments quieted and the cameras moved on, one fact remained unchanged. The chamber they had entered was not the end. Beyond the inscriptions, beyond the symbols, beyond the message that had already unsettled scholars and believers alike, there was still another boundary, a final threshold left untouched. Its presence was subtle but undeniable, hinted at by gaps in the geometry, by measurements that pointed forward rather than inward, a continuation. This was not oversight, it was design. If King Solomon intended his tomb to be found, he would have marked it. If he intended his secrets to be claimed, he would have made them accessible. Instead, what remained suggested restraint, taken to its ultimate conclusion, a place prepared, a path partially revealed, and a final chamber deliberately withheld, which forces the question back to the beginning. If this place was never meant to be disturbed, not because it was empty, not because it was forgotten, then what condition had Solomon expected to be met before the last seal could be broken? Was it knowledge? Wisdom? Maturity? Or was it something far more difficult to measure, a moment in history when humanity might finally understand the cost of knowing too much? Because wisdom, as Solomon understood it, was never simply about insight. It was about timing, about knowing when not to act, about recognizing that some doors, once opened, do not close again. And perhaps that is the final message hidden beneath stone and silence, not a treasure to be claimed, not a secret to be exposed, but a test, a question posed across millennia, waiting not for the right tools or the right theories, but for the right restraint. The tomb has been opened, the message has been heard, but the final chamber still waits, and until the world decides whether it is ready to step forward or wise enough to step back, the most important question remains unanswered, just because we can open it. Should we? A place never meant to be disturbed. This was not the language used for ordinary tombs. Kings were buried with honor, warriors with ceremony. Even feared rulers were remembered openly, their graves marked, their names carved into stone. What surrounded the resting place of King Solomon, however, was something different entirely. The texts did not describe a site of mourning. They described a boundary. Solomon was remembered as the wisest man who ever lived. A king who asked not for long life or victory, but for understanding. And according to tradition, he was granted insight that surpassed his age. Insight into justice, into power, and into the hidden order of things. Yet those same writings hint that wisdom, when carried too far, becomes dangerous not because it is evil, but because it gives humanity access to forces it may not know how to control. This is why the warnings matter. They never say the place is empty. They never suggest it was forgotten. Instead, they imply intention that something was placed there carefully, sealed deliberately, and left behind not as a gift, but as a responsibility deferred. In several ancient commentaries, the language turns subtle but unmistakable. Knowledge that governs creation, symbols that bind authority, understanding that, once released, cannot be returned to silence. These passages do not forbid discovery outright. They caution against timing, against uncovering what the world may not yet be prepared to bear. And that is what makes this warning unsettling. Because if the tomb of Solomon was truly sealed for thousands of years, it raises a question far more troubling than where it was hidden. It forces us to ask why it was hidden, and who decided that the future should not yet see what lay inside. Before there were archaeologists, before there were instruments, before there was science capable of probing stone and earth, there was already a voice saying, "This place should remain closed." And now, for the first time in millennia, that warning was about to be tested. Who, Solomon, really was wisdom with weight? History often reduces King Solomon to a single trait: wisdom. It is the word most commonly attached to his name, repeated so often that it feels almost harmless. A wise king, a fair ruler, a gifted judge. But wisdom, in Solomon's case, was never gentle. It carried weight. It reshaped nations. According to the earliest accounts, King Solomon did not inherit a fragile throne. He inherited a kingdom already forged by conquest. What he inherited, however, was not stability. It was pressure, internal division, external threats. A young king placed at the center of immense power before he was fully formed himself. And Solomon did not rule by force alone. Under his reign, trade routes expanded across continents. Ships sailed beyond familiar waters to places described only in fragments, lands rich with gold, ivory, spices, and materials unknown in Israel before his time. Wealth did not arrive slowly. It poured in. Gold became common. Silver lost value. Resources moved with a coordination that suggests planning far beyond simple commerce. At the heart of his kingdom stood the first temple, not merely a religious structure, but a technological and symbolic achievement. Built over 7 years, it combined imported cedar, massive precision-cut stone, and layers of gold that turned architecture into authority. Nothing about it was improvised. Every dimension, every ratio, every measurement followed a pattern recorded with almost obsessive care. Solomon's wisdom was not abstract. It was applied. He understood systems, political, economic, and spiritual, and how they intersected. His most famous judgment, the case of the 2 women claiming the same child, was not a display of cruelty, but of psychological insight. He exposed truth not by force, but by understanding human nature at its breaking point. That reputation spread far beyond Israel. Rulers came not to challenge his armies, but to test his mind. The Queen of Sheba's visit was not ceremonial, it was investigative. She arrived with riddles, questions, and wealth not as tribute, but as currency for access. And she left shaken not by what Solomon owned, but by what he knew. This is the Solomon the warnings refer to. Not a philosopher king removed from consequence, but a ruler whose understanding reached into areas others barely perceived. And that is where the unease begins. Because wisdom, when paired with absolute authority, leaves traces. It shapes decisions that do not announce themselves loudly. It prepares contingencies. It anticipates futures that others cannot yet imagine. If Solomon truly possessed insight that exceeded his age, then the question shifts. Not whether he would hide something, but why he would choose to. Kings are remembered for what they build, but the most dangerous rulers are defined by what they decide to bury. And if Solomon buried something with such care that history itself lost the trail, then whatever lay behind that decision was never meant to be ordinary. For a king of Solomon's stature, absence is the strangest detail of all. History preserves rulers through monuments, through inscriptions, through burial chambers, meant to outlast dynasties. Even kings who were hated were remembered in stone. Yet when it comes to King Solomon, the record breaks. There is no confirmed tomb, no marked grave, no chamber bearing his name, no inscription recording where the most powerful ruler of Israel was laid to rest. This is not a minor omission. It is a historical anomaly. Solomon ruled at the height of Israel's wealth and influence. His reign was meticulously documented: taxes, construction, trade, temple measurements, even personal judgments were recorded with precision. And yet, when the narrative reaches his death, the details fade. The texts move on. The trail stops. Scholars have wrestled with this silence for centuries. Some believed his tomb must lie beneath the Temple Mount itself, hidden under layers of later construction. Others suggested remote caves, sealed chambers, or burial sites deliberately concealed to protect royal remains from desecration. Each theory sparked expeditions. Each expedition failed. Medieval knights dug beneath Jerusalem, convinced that sacred architecture hid sacred answers. 19th-century explorers carved through the Judean hills with maps, compasses, and confidence. Modern archaeologists applied surveys, scans, and stratigraphy. Nothing. Over time, the search lost urgency. Too many false leads. Too many legends built on rumor rather than evidence. Eventually, the mystery was labeled unsolvable. Solomon's tomb became a question historians learned to step around rather than confront. But silence, in archaeology, is rarely neutral. When history forgets an insignificant figure, it is understandable. When it forgets a king like Solomon, it suggests intervention. The absence does not feel accidental. It feels engineered. Because forgetting something of this magnitude requires effort. It requires decisions made, early instructions given, locations omitted, references softened or removed. Someone, at some point, ensured that Solomon's final resting place would not be easily traced, and that raises a disturbing possibility. What if the tomb was never lost? What if it was never meant to be found? If Solomon's wisdom carried consequences beyond his lifetime, then concealing his burial was not an oversight. It was a final act of control, a way to ensure that whatever he chose to seal away would remain untouched, not just by his enemies, but by history itself. The missing tomb is not an empty space in the record. It is a deliberate gap. And gaps like that exist for a reason. There is a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Quiet enough to be overlooked, yet consistent enough to be undeniable. When knowledge becomes powerful enough to reshape society, humanity does not simply spread it, it contains it. This instinct appears long before modern governments, before laboratories, before digital systems. Ancient civilizations understood something we rarely acknowledge today, that information, once released, cannot be recalled. And when its consequences are irreversible, the safest option is not destruction, but control. What is striking is how rarely dangerous knowledge is erased. Libraries burn, texts vanish, records disappear, but the most consequential ideas are almost never destroyed completely. Instead, they are fragmented, encoded, passed only through narrow channels. Preserved, but out of reach. The goal was not ignorance, it was restraint. This habit did not arise from fear alone. It arose from experience. Early societies learned that certain forms of understanding about power, structure, nature, and authority could destabilize entire orders if placed in the wrong hands or revealed at the wrong time. Once knowledge crossed a certain threshold, it stopped being neutral. It began to act, and so civilizations adapted. They built hierarchies of access. They created inner circles. They distinguished between what could be taught publicly and what must be guarded privately. Knowledge survived, but selectively. This is why ancient warnings rarely say, "This must be destroyed." They say, "This must be protected." Protection, in this context, did not mean preservation alone. It meant delay. It meant deciding that the future, not the present, would bear the burden of understanding. It meant trusting time itself to act as a filter. That is the habit we inherit. When we encounter sealed texts, forbidden chambers, restricted doctrines, or hidden archives, we often assume superstition or control for its own sake. But history suggests a more uncomfortable possibility: that some of what was sealed by people who understood its implications better than we do now. This reframes discoveries like Solomon's tomb entirely. They are not anomalies. They are expressions of a long-standing human response to power disguised as wisdom. The question, then, is not why ancient societies hid knowledge. The question is why we assume we are different, because the instinct to seal dangerous understanding did not disappear. It only changed form. And before we judge the past for what it chose to hide, we must confront a harder truth. We are still doing the same thing, just with different materials, different systems, and far greater consequences. In the Old Testament, knowledge is never treated as neutral. From the earliest pages of Scripture, understanding is portrayed as something that carries weight, something that can bless, but also something that can break. The Bible does not present wisdom as inherently safe. It presents it as powerful, and therefore dangerous, when misused or encountered too early. The first warning appears not with violence, but with curiosity. In Genesis, humanity's fall does not begin with rebellion in action. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not hidden because it was meaningless. It was placed in plain sight and restricted, not destroyed, not erased, simply withheld. The consequence was immediate and irreversible. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Genesis 3:22. Knowledge altered humanity's position in creation, not because knowledge itself was evil, but because it shifted responsibility beyond what humanity was prepared to bear. From that moment forward, Scripture consistently treats wisdom as something that must be matched by character, or it becomes a liability. This tension appears again in the book of Proverbs, traditionally attributed to Solomon himself. Wisdom is praised relentlessly, yet always with a warning embedded in its pursuit. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom without reverence is not celebrated. Wisdom without restraint is not wisdom at all. Throughout the Old Testament, God repeatedly withholds knowledge not permanently, but conditionally. Prophets are shown visions they do not fully understand. Kings are given insight without complete explanation. Even Moses, the closest figure to divine presence, is told plainly that there are limits to what he may see. You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Exodus 33-20. This is not punishment, it is protection. The pattern becomes clearer as Scripture unfolds. Knowledge that exposes the structure of reality, power, creation, authority, is treated as volatile. When revealed prematurely or entrusted to the unprepared, it leads not to enlightenment, but to collapse. This is why certain revelations in the Old Testament arrive sealed. Daniel is shown visions of future kingdoms and catastrophic shifts in history. Yet at the end, he is told, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, until the time of the end." Daniel 12-4. The instruction is explicit. The knowledge is real, but the timing is wrong. Here, sealing is not an act of censorship. It is an act of stewardship. This biblical framework changes how we interpret hidden chambers, sealed texts, and restricted understanding. From a scriptural perspective, concealment is not evidence of deception. It is evidence of discernment. A recognition that some truths require a world capable of receiving them without self-destruction. And this brings the story back to Solomon. If Solomon truly stood within this biblical tradition, a king shaped by Scripture, aware of its warnings, then sealing knowledge would not have been an act of fear. It would have been an act of obedience. A decision aligned with a worldview that understood wisdom as something to be guarded, not displayed. In that light, Solomon's actions no longer feel mysterious. They feel consistent. Because in the Old Testament, knowledge becomes dangerous, not when it is false, but when it is true, and revealed without the wisdom required to carry it. And if Scripture is correct, then the question facing the modern world is not whether sealed knowledge exists. It is whether we have learned anything from the times when opening it came at a cost humanity could not afford to pay. Once knowledge was recognized as dangerous, a new role emerged in human history: the gatekeeper. In ancient societies, access to understanding was never equal. This was not an accident of illiteracy or poor communication. It was a design choice. Knowledge that shaped reality about governance, cosmology, sacred law, or power was placed into narrow hands: priests, kings, prophets, scribes. These were not merely professions. They were filters. What the wider population received were symbols, stories, rituals, and laws, simplified enough to guide behavior without exposing underlying mechanisms. What remained hidden were structures, how authority functioned, how order was maintained, how the unseen governed the seen. This is why ancient wisdom is layered. The surface level instructs, the inner level explains. The deepest level is restricted. Initiation mattered. Lineage mattered. Moral standing mattered. In many traditions, knowledge was not taught. It was entrusted. And once entrusted, it came with consequences. Those who carried it were judged more harshly, held to stricter standards, and punished more severely for failure. Scripture reflects this hierarchy clearly. Prophets receive visions the people do not. Priests handle sacred objects others cannot touch. Kings are granted insight tied directly to their responsibility. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. Conferred Deuteronomic principle later echoed in Luke. The pattern is consistent. Access increases accountability. This structure, was not about elitism. It was about containment. Ancient cultures understood that knowledge scales faster than wisdom. Give advanced understanding to an unprepared society, and the result is not progress, it is instability. That is why sacred spaces were divided. Outer courts for the people, inner courts for priests. The Holy of Holies for one man, once a year. The architecture itself enforced epistemology. It taught, without words, that not everyone stands in the same place before truth. And when knowledge crossed boundaries without preparation, the consequences were severe. Unauthorized access was not treated as curiosity. It was treated as violation. This is where modern readers often misunderstand the past. We assume secrecy implies manipulation. Ancient societies assumed openness implied danger. To them, hiding knowledge was not a betrayal of humanity. It was an act of preservation of social order, spiritual balance, and survival itself. This framework matters, because when Solomon appears in history, he does not invent this system. For generations, it was dismissed as folklore until a forgotten passage beneath Jerusalem forced the conversation open again. Centuries of searching had carved tunnels through the hills, driven by whispers of a king buried with wealth beyond imagination, a ruler whose name refused to fade with time. Solomon, remembered not only for wisdom, but for presiding over a kingdom whose scale stunned the ancient world. Solomon did not ascend the throne as a fully formed monarch. He became king while still young, inheriting a kingdom shaped by his father, David, a realm forged through conflict, consolidation, and fragile unity. What Solomon inherited was not peace, but pressure. And what he created was not merely stability, but scale. Under his reign, the kingdom did not simply survive. It expanded economically, politically, and logistically. Trade routes flourished beyond Israel's borders. Wealth did not trickle in, it surged. Gold became common. Silver lost its value. This was not the profile of a symbolic ruler. It was the signature of a centralized authority capable of organizing resources across regions. At the heart of Solomon's power stood his most enduring achievement, the First Temple. Built over 7 years, it was not a modest sanctuary. It was a massive construction project requiring imported cedar from Lebanon, precision-cut stone, and enormous quantities of metal. Solomon's famous judgments reinforce this picture. Like the one where 2 women claimed the same child, Solomon offered to split the child in half, not out of cruelty, but to see who would give him up. And one did. That's how he found the real mother. That single moment turned him into a symbol of justice and intelligence across the ancient world. His reputation traveled far beyond Jerusalem. The Queen of Sheba did not arrive as a pilgrim. She came as an equal, bringing riddles, wealth, and diplomatic intent. Caravans heavy with spices and gold crossed deserts to reach him. She left not simply impressed, but unsettled. This is where the image of Solomon begins to shift, because wisdom, when paired with absolute authority, leaves footprints. It reshapes economies. It reorganizes trade. It alters landscapes. Ships sailed to distant ports named Ophir and Tarshish, places many believe lay in Africa or even as far as India, returning with ivory, exotic animals, and rare goods. And beneath this wealth was something far less poetic, but far more revealing: metal. In regions to the south, including areas near the Timnah Valley and across Edom, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of large-scale copper production active in the very century. Solomon is said to have ruled industrial operations capable of supplying the kind of material his projects required. These were not symbolic resources. They were the backbone of an empire. And yet, One question has never been answered. Where is Solomon's tomb? There is no confirmed burial chamber, no marker, no inscription, nothing to indicate where a ruler of such scale was laid to rest. Some believed it must lie beneath the Temple Mount itself. Others pointed to hidden caves, sealed chambers, places deliberately erased from memory. Over time, the search stalled. Too many dead ends, too many legends layered over fact. Most scholars eventually walked away. But the silence never fully settled, because when a king leaves behind infrastructure, trade systems, and industrial footprints, his absence is not easily explained. And that is where this story begins to change. What followed was described by some as chance, by others as inevitability, but either way, it shattered a mystery that had resisted centuries of pursuit. What emerged was not simply a burial site, it was a signal, a deliberately concealed system, sealed in silence for nearly 3,000 years, now forcing itself back into view. And what lay within was only the beginning. The search for Solomon's tomb had always felt futile. Medieval knights, once carved into the earth beneath the Temple Mount, convinced the answer lay directly below their feet. Centuries later, 19th-century explorers tore through the hills of Judea, guided by maps that promised everything and delivered nothing. Each attempt ended the same way: empty tunnels, collapsed theories, and quiet resignation. By the time the modern era arrived, most scholars had stopped looking altogether. Then the evidence shifted. Dr. Emily Carter, an archaeologist more comfortable among fragile manuscripts than excavation sites, was deep inside Jerusalem's archival records when something refused to be ignored. Ancient tax documents from the era traditionally attributed to Solomon contained a subtle irregularity. Payments recorded without a destination, resources accounted for, but deliberately detached from place. In a kingdom where metal, labor, and tribute were tightly managed, as proven by contemporaneous copper production operating at industrial scale, in the South, such omissions were not clerical errors. They were intentional. The trail pointed toward a location near the city of David, a site referenced only indirectly, positioned just far enough outside official records to vanish from memory. As one historian put it, if you dig beneath that ground, what rises from the soil has a habit of matching ancient text. Using ground-penetrating radar capable of reading through solid limestone, Carter's team turned their focus to a steep, unforgiving slope in Silwan. The terrain resisted every step. Jagged rock tore at equipment. Unstable soil slowed progress. Political tensions halted work repeatedly, yet they returned, day after day, because whatever was hidden there had not survived by accident. Then nature intervened. A sudden rainstorm weakened the hillside, exposing a shallow depression in the earth. At first glance it looked unremarkable, but something about it felt wrong, out of place. Beneath that exact point, radar readings surged, pulsing with unnatural regularity. The scans revealed tunnels, deep, purpose-cut, man-made, carved nearly 13 meters below the surface. Excitement rippled through the team. The site was secured immediately. Every movement became calculated, because this was not a simple passageway. The tunnel system was engineered with false entrances and dead ends, a defensive layout consistent with other high-value sites tied to royal infrastructure, where missteps were designed to trigger collapse and erase intrusion. Night after night, Dr. Carter studied fragments of ancient inscriptions recovered nearby. The markings were not ornamental. They were directional, subtle cues meant to mislead the careless and guide only those patient enough to read them correctly. The intelligence behind the design echoed the same logistical thinking required to manage large-scale mining and resource transport centuries earlier. Yet even that was not the true turning point. The moment came from an old story, a fragment of oral tradition passed down by shepherds who spoke of a hillside that glowed beneath moonlight, of a wall that shimmered like scattered stars. Standing on that very slope, Carter felt it immediately. The ground was saturated. Boots sank with every step. The air felt heavy, intentional, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. They knew they were close. Beyond the sealed passage, behind a doorway untouched since antiquity, something waited, and when the ancient seal was finally broken, the impact was immediate. This was not a quiet discovery. It was a release. A stone slab, never meant to be disturbed, shifted with a sound that echoed like something long restrained, finally exhaling. What if the only thing separating the modern world from a 3,000-year-old secret? That was the moment history stopped feeling distant. The seal did not give way gently. When it finally moved, it did so with force, a deep, resonant roar. Like something ancient releasing a breath it had been holding for thousands of years. After weeks of cutting through jagged limestone, choking dust, and lingering uncertainty, Emily Carter and her team stood at the end of a trail that began not in myth, but in paperwork, faded tax records that led them to a forgotten hillside in Silwan. Now, they faced a stone slab buried so deeply that it felt as though the earth itself had worked to conceal it. This was no ordinary obstruction. The slab functioned as more than a door. It was a boundary, a warning, a piece of engineering meant to be understood, not forced. Pushing or pulling would accomplish nothing. The stone was integrated into a larger system, one designed to protect whatever lay beyond it. Within the tunnel walls, false corridors branched away from the true path. Dead ends lurked, where a wrong step could trigger collapse,